Today we have two very distinguished authors. They're going to present a paper on suspicion, surveillance, and safety, the new imperative for public space. The first author here is Professor Tridib Banerjee. He is the James Irwin Chair in Urban and Regional Planning and the Director of our graduate programs in Urban Planning at SPPD. He has published widely on the design and planning of the built environment and how it relates to human and social consequences. He's also published on the effects of globalization in the transformation of the urban form and urbanization from a comparative and international perspective. His work has taken him all over the world, from China to Germany to Morocco to Mexico, and his current research interest includes the implementation of smart growth policies, converting brownfields to affordable housing, and having walkable communities. He co-authored a book, he's also written lots of books and co-authored one particular book on design downtown, poetics and politics of form, which is about the emerging appearance of downtown urban forms in 1998. He co-authored that book with Dr. Anastasia Loukaitou-Sideris from UCLA. She is the co-author here on this paper as well. She is the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs, and she is an urban planning professor at UCLA's Meyer and Renee Luskin School of Public Affairs. She has also authored numerous articles and books. Her research focuses on the public environment of the city, its physical representations, aesthetics, social meaning, and impact on the urban resident. Her work seeks to integrate the social and physical issues in urban planning and architecture. And her research has documented and analyzed the social and physical changes that have occurred in the public realm. For instance, she has a book called Sidewalks, which is about the public conflict over sidewalks in the urban landscape. So they will be presenting their paper today, and afterwards we will have some comments from Associate Professor Lisa Schweitzer. She is a professor here at SPPD. She specializes in urban studies and in particular in social justice, environment, and transportation. And then we'll open up for questions.
I'll begin by introducing the subject matter in the context of this paper. First of all, it's a real pleasure to have Anastasia here. The one thing that Nicole has mentioned in the introduction with Anastasia is one of our distinguished alumna, so it's good to have her back here. This paper we actually did for a symposium that was convened by Susan Feinstein and Naomi Carmon of the Technion University in Haifa. And then it's coming out as a chapter in a book edited by Feinstein and Carmon to be published by University of Pennsylvania Press. And the title, I was just checking with Anastasia, it's something like planning with people, for and with people, a little bit of a corny title, looking back to the future or something like that. But something like that. So they asked us to do a chapter on urban space and public space. So we kind of focused on that because this sort of had some convergence on our both interests in this area and our previous work on public space. But one thing I should let you know that in contrast to some of the other papers presented in the seminar, this is not an empirical research paper. It is more conceptual, and it's but it draws from previous research that we have done. So, quickly moving on, I need to. So those of you old enough to remember that famous song by Paul Simon, I'm not a very good singer, I will sing it for you. Laughing on the bus, playing games with faces. He said, the man in the gabardine suit was a spy. I said, be careful, his bow tie is a camera. That's sort of our one kind of opening premise. Now, this was written in 1968 during the Vietnam War days. But the basic premise we propose in this paper is that the social contract in the Western liberal democracies that are based on the notion of openness, access, trust, freedom of speech, and diversity is increasingly being compromised these days, with the obsession with the safety, security, and surveillance in the post-9/11 era. So if the Al-Qaeda wanted to hurt the United States, I think they have hurt it very well, not by taking down the two towers, but basically making major damage in some of the essential civil liberties of the American society. So there, we developed the argument that there is a kind of an assault on public space, and this is not just the surveillance aspect of it, but also what can be called the enclosure of the commons or encroachment of an urban public space. Some of the neoliberal economic thinking is quite advocating that indeed the common, as we have traditionally known, does not have to be necessarily common in the usual sense. It could be privatized. It could be treated as a commodity. So the scope of the talk is, I'm not sure exactly when I'm supposed to give it to you, Anastasia. Are you supposed to come in here or no? It's okay. So anyway, so these are the generally the bullet point shows the items we want to cover, the nuances of the concept of the public and the private, the rise of the surveillance society as we claim it is, we are in the middle of now, the role of the technology and the planning and design, role of planning and design in the enclosure of the common notion, and the consequence of the rising fear and insecurity, and sort of the future of the public space more broadly. So I think you start here, Anastasia, I believe?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for a very kind introduction. It's always when I come here, it's like homecoming to me because I really care a lot about this place. I have 3 degrees from USC, so I'm a proud alumni. So thank you for inviting me. Well, I think it's worth spending a few minutes theorizing a little bit about the concept of public space, because, and kind of thinking about what is public space, because often the tendency is to define it by what it is not, basically in contradistinction to private space, as if it is an exclusively bipolar relationship. We know better, not only us, but a number of people that have been working in this area of public space, that there are different shades of publicness and privateness. However, the distinction between public and private has been contentious, and it has undergone transformations both existentially and theoretically. In general, in Western liberal democracies, the roles and purposes of public space are related and quite intrinsic to the larger concepts of the public sphere and the public realm. And these two notions are foundationally related to the distinction between the private and the public in liberal political philosophy. We have landmark works, of course, by Habermas, and his conception of the bourgeois public sphere, where private citizens participate in public discourse, somewhat reminiscent of pre-modern times and the Greek agoras. And of course, we have landmark work by Hannah Arendt and her distinction between the private realm of the home and the public realm of all that lies outside one's home. And this definition by Arendt pretty much included what we call traditional public spaces, the streets, the alleys, the parks, the passages, which certainly today are part of our notion for public space, but this notion has expanded quite significantly in what people call the cyber civitas, the blogosphere, the social networks. Nevertheless, for most people's minds, when we talk about the concept of public space, we talk about openness, tolerance, permissiveness, protecting First Amendment rights. So, for example, you would not easily see the behavior of the people of the far right kind of, lying and enjoying public space in a space like this, which is, most of you have recognized the Bellagio. This is more of a privatized public space where it is very likely that a security guard will come and definitely get you out of the space. And there is quite some screening. And actually, by the way, even the sidewalks of this property are private and do not belong to the public sector. They belong to the hotel that operates the Bellagio. And I should say that sometimes there may be some blurring of the distinction. Anybody recognizes what the space here? Yes? The Americana. For people that don't know, if you see that, you may think this is a public space. It's not. There are certain clues that you get while you're there. And quite often, this blurring of distinction is quite vehemently opposed by the private owners of these spaces that try to make quite sure that this is a private space. I don't know how many of you have walked in downtown and see a number of plaques engraved on the pavement that say that this is private space, kind of along the property line, and passing through the space can be revoked at any time according to some municipal ordinance. The Weintraub actually names 4 different intellectual traditions that have historically addressed the tension between public and private space: political theory, liberal economic theory, socialist theory, and feminist theory. And these theoretical categories, I'll say a few things for each one of them, provide the theoretical framework for our paper that explores the changing notions of the public space. Political theorists define the public in the context of citizenship, public sphere, democracy, and civil society. And people like Margaret Cohn argue quite forcefully that political imperatives of public space are fundamentally linked to First Amendment rights in the US and must be protected and nurtured. Public space provides the setting for activities like this, demonstrations and protests. We can only remember Tiananmen Square in '89, in Beijing, downtown Seattle in '99, Paris in 2005, Tahrir Square in Cairo in 2011, Syntagma Square in Athens today, actually as we speak. Well, not as we speak, it's night, but earlier in the morning. And many other instances where public space has served as the setting for the expression of people's beliefs, ideology, and dissent. So all this is part of the discussion by political theorists. The liberal economic theory, on the other hand, often conflates this distinction between public and private with that between the state and the market, or between public and private goods. This distinction, however, is increasingly tenuous because the state is becoming increasingly entrepreneurial, assuming a corporate role oftentimes in partnership with the private sector. And sometimes there is a blurring of distinction in the two sectors, something that we are actually experiencing in academia. There is a blurring of distinction between public and private universities, and public universities increasingly assuming similar roles, certainly in fundraising, with private universities. The third distinction between the private and public arises out of various tenets of social theory: social life, social contract, sociability, civility, community, and public life. And all these constructs involve our engagement in the public, our public personas, public encounters, social contracts, conviviality, and so on. And in this conception of the public, the conventional representations of public space, the traditional public spaces, the squares, the plazas, the promenades, are quite relevant and indeed remain one of the few claims for the role of the public space in the public sphere and civil society. Nevertheless, even this role has been questioned in the era of privatism, and this is something that Richard Sennett, famously in 1979, Richard Sennett, who will come here to give a talk at UCLA, called the fall of public men. Two elements that are central to the notion of public life that concern public space, however, under this tradition, is diversity and multiplicity of ideas and opinions, and something that might be a bit more controversial, exposure to risk and vulnerability. And this type of public space in social theory actually calls for more tolerance for this tolerance of risk and unpredictability. Finally, and I'm going quite fast, we spent much more time in the chapter, in feminist theories, the distinction between public and private sometimes equates between the distinction between the private household, the family household, and the political community. Many feminist theorists have argued that in some cultures, this distinction is tantamount to a gendering of urban space, and according to these cultural norms, public space is a male domain, private space is more of a female domain. So these are the four perspectives, provide some of the theoretical background of our talk. The intrinsic qualities of public space, openness, actually I think I have to go back. Oops. Accessibility, freedom of speech, and diversity oftentimes become a threat to state authorities and private agencies that sometimes seem to view public space as quite susceptible to anomie, disorder, risk, and danger. And it is true that public spaces provide opportunities for unpredictable encounters, encounters that at times make us uncomfortable. Homelessness, panhandling, it is something that I deal much more extensively in the Sidewalk book. There is also this the social pathology, the urban pathology of public spaces, and the feelings of vulnerability that have become widespread because public spaces are seen as susceptible to crime, or even worse, acts of terrorism. And this fear of being victimized colors the perceptions that quite often authorities have of public space and how it has to be regulated. And I should say that this is not only in the United States or even the Western world, because in many parts of the world, many everyday life spaces, the bus stops, markets, restaurants, have indeed become targets of terrorist attacks. Of course, it remains much more unlikely that someone will become a victim of this attack. It is much more likely that someone will be hit by an automobile. But this perception of public space is something that really colors its image. Streets and squares, as I have discussed, have also the potential to serve as theaters of dissent, and this right to take to the streets underlies the freedom of expression and democracy, and the scripts of dissensus in public space are quite familiar in modern times. There are marches and sit-ins and rallies and candlelight vigils. Most of these are civil protests that are not aggressive, they're peaceful, but still there is the possibility of aggressive and violent dissent. And as has happened with the WTO demonstration in Seattle, and aggressive encounters and conflicts with the police. These uses of public space for the expression of dissent have been described as a fundamental right to the city, notably by Henri Lefebvre. However, these are exactly the type of uses that are threatened by the dark side of public spaces, the crime. And in response to this perception, we see two counteractions, specific times that give rise to the surveillance society. One happens in the early 19th century, where we see the development of state bureaucracies associated with the emergence of modernism. The second happens in the second part of the 20th century, where we see proliferation and mass marketing of computer and digital technologies. And of course, the third gets even more enhanced after 9/11 and other terrorist attack, and it's the fear of terrorism. So in terms of the first one, before I go into the first one, I want to remind everyone what the exercise of surveillance involves. It involves collection and storage of information about people and objects, supervision of social activities through instructions or physical design, and application of information gathering activities to monitoring the behavior of those that are under supervision. In terms of the first instance where we first start observing the rise of surveillance, we can securely say that it is associated with modernity, the emergence of nation states and public bureaucracies, and their seeing needs. The states derive authority from scientific and technological advances that allow for organization, order, efficiency of large piles of data, propensity to collect and store information in the form of maps, aerial photographs, census, tax rolls, surveys, land use data. social identities become traceable, social security cards, driver's license numbers, and not only actually by the state, but also by private corporations that now know our consuming preferences, our health condition, and so on and so forth. We also see the rise of specialized bureaucratic institutions that handle this data and process this data. And of course, what interests us are the spatial connotations. In the pre-modern times, the perception of danger was coming from outside, and we see the development of acropolises and fortresses to protect from this enemy from outside. After the development of the modern state, increasingly the perception comes from within. We have Baron Haussmann in Paris widening the streets so that the troops can come in and better police the street and react to possible rioting. We have the development in the 19th century of municipal ordinances and regulations to pretty much guard anomie and behavior of citizens or rioting. And so these are the spatial manifestations. Then in the 20th century, especially after World War II, we see a proliferation of information, computing, and digital technologies. And we eventually reach what Dana Kaff has called the pervasive computing, which is now undertaken not only by state bureaucracies, but also by corporate actors and even households. And there has been an interesting literature that is developing about parents that are using GPS technology to monitor their kids. So by no means this is only something that state agencies are doing. And of course, we have CCTV technologies and GPS technologies. The City of London is the pioneer in kind of putting these cameras almost everywhere, followed by a number of cities. In Japan, here in LA, I'm told that the USC Campus Police has cameras around neighborhoods and intersections, et cetera, et cetera. So we're all quite familiar with all that. And of course, the third and last event, if you like, is 9/11, the events in London, in Madrid, other parts of the world, and the reactions to them that really intensify surveillance. We have the development of Homeland Security here, the Patriot Act, and expand surveillance to either other aspects of everyday life, libraries, public spaces, and so on and so forth. I'm going to turn to Tridib to discuss, he will discuss the second reaction that has to do with the encroachment of public space. So thank you.
Okay, so I'll try to move along quickly. Some of these points we already made, that this growing tendency of privatization of space and the enclosure of the common, enclosure of public spaces, and this range from gated communities to shopping malls and sometimes streets and neighborhoods and things like that. And the argument here is that this sort of leads to a kind of a social exclusion and of certain types of people whom we don't like to see amongst us. So it takes away this fundamental openness, a democratic space notion that Richard Sennett talks about, and increasingly it leads to segregation and separation of classes. And a lot of it is being fed by the mistrust, suspicion, and fear of the other. So when Ed Blakely did this study of the gated community, the rise of the gated communities in America, one of the reasons why people thought they live in gated communities is because of the safety. Now, I'm not going to read all of it, but basically, if you look at the kind of our history of the suburban growth and the way the suburbia's environment has been created by very controlled land uses, not allowing mixed land uses, all of those things have, and increasingly leading to more gated communities, have sort of created a kind of tendency of very segregated, enclosed, privatized, isolated sort of pixels, urban pixels in the world. So you can sort of edit out all of the nasty side of the risks and dangers that are associated with public spaces. And so some of it is, of course, you see in a lot of the design of the shopping malls and the like. And even though the shopping malls are sort of an interesting case of public space, that it has been challenged in many places whether the shopping mall is truly public space. And interestingly, in the state Supreme Courts in different states have ruled differently. And there's quite a bit of ambivalence about that. In more progressive states like state of Washington, Massachusetts, California, the state Supreme Courts have ruled that well, if the mall is supposed to serve as a public function, then it is, yes, it will be treated as a public space. But the question is, how far can you stretch that? Can you give a speech there? Probably not. It's like a Hyde Park soapbox thing. I doubt you can do that in a shopping mall. Can you hand out leaflets? Can you have a bake sale, raise money for some cause? The kinds of things that you can do in a truly public space. I don't think you are quite allowed to do that, but generally, so certainly your First Amendment rights are not, would be hard to sort of enforce in the public space. These kinds of, on the other hand, the private sector, the developers are creating environments which are creating these kinds of scripted public spaces. This is a place in San Diego, can't remember the name of the wonderful little development in the middle of nowhere, but it's all complete with housing and shopping mall and you know, the community parks and even the music entertainment came with it. This is, of course, from our an earlier picture of the 7th Street Marketplace. But this is what we're getting to more closely, the use of the surveillance camera. And of course, you know, Mike Davis, whom you all know, wrote in his City of Courts, devoted a chapter to what he calls the Fortress Los Angeles, kind of parallel to the Fortress America. So these are becoming sort of the rather sort of commonplace phenomenon today. In UK, for example, there is an enormous number of CCTV installation all over the city of London. In American cities, it's not as extensive, but it is growing. And not only it covers the public-private spaces, but it also includes the public spaces immediately outside the private space. So the question then becomes sort of the, you know, what sort of future of public space, what can planners do? So the one issue, for example, comes up is the beyond the First Amendment. So whether if there is also a case for the Fourth Amendment. And I want to read something from this paper on that. So the Fourth Amendment is about illegal search and seizure, right? So this fellow Blitz wrote on I think Yale or New York University Law Review. They're saying that the legal scholars in the U.S. are now revisiting the Fourth Amendment protection for the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. Now, according to 1967 Supreme Court decision, Katz versus the United States, this protection, however, did not extend to the public space. The Supreme Court didn't allow that because, quote, what a person knowingly exposes to the public, unquote, is not a subject of Fourth Amendment protection. But the CCTV surveillance and archiving of surveillance videos are not being constrained by the Fourth Amendment, but questioning this outcome, this fellow Blitz argues that government agencies equipped with visual records of citizen public activities are highly problematic, as even a video archive that includes only a person's movements or public settings would inevitably reveal much that he would rather not share with an audience, let alone have incorporated into official records, like visiting a marriage counselor's office, or going to your shrink, or so visit a psychiatrist's office, marriage counseling center, or abortion clinic. These are nobody's business. But in this kind of an open situation, these are all being recorded systematically by these closed circuits. So he argued the best way to extend the constitutional limits to the public spaces like parks, plazas, sidewalks, and the likes is to emphasize that while the Fourth Amendment, quote, does not protect the privacy of, quote, unquote, places, it should extend to, quote, the privacy of the people in these places, and its protections can move with people as they leave their home and move from place to place, taking private information with them. So basically, this fellow is arguing that Fourth Amendment rights should travel with you. It doesn't end when you leave your house. You carry it with you. So the planners, I think we need to be vigilant about these enclosure of the commons and social exclusion also, the kind of thing that's going on today. And we should also strive for, conviviality, propinquity, social contact, all of the other sort of openness through design. But I must say that there is some limit to how much planners can do that, because on the one hand, this information and communication technology, which gave us this surveillance technology, has also given the average citizen the cell phone. And as Anastasia is saying, that the parents are now using GPS technology, or give kids a cell phone where they can always track where the kid is. But also anybody can take any picture in public space. So even if you don't have the CCTV camera, somebody else can take a picture of you. So one outcome might be, as Yoshini says, that we might be covering ourselves. So the way you'll be carrying a Fourth Amendment right is because you will have a wide-brimmed hats, big sunglasses, or a big parasol, or even in extreme cases wearing a wig or a false mustache, and so that's how you protect your privacy. And so the covering might be that individually you might be sort of adapting ourselves to that kind of phenomenon. So today, not the bow tie, but the cell phone is the camera, and available to all, which sends images instantly to websites for wide dissemination, if not evidence for police investigation. And as you know, that in Rodney King and others, we have the individual cell phones or cameras have recorded a lot of stuff that was not otherwise would not have been gone unnoticed. So we're now not only the object of, but also collaborators in our own surveillance. So indeed, we succumb to the fun and intrigue of these technological possibilities and promises, and are willing participants and consumers of the new marketplace of technological surveillance. So ultimately, of course, there's a planners what we like to see is the public spaces of this kind, as is happening in New York City, where the Broadway, rather drastic kind of measures taken by Mayor Bloomberg and his transportation commissioner, Janet Sadiq Khan, increasing sort of closure of streets for bikeways, and also this particular segment of Broadway for sort of wonderful kind of creation of public space. And this is the kind of public space that Richard Sennett dreams about, the true democratic public space where anybody can come, bring your, chaise lounge or portable aluminum fold-out chair and see a show, or just enjoy the sun. So I guess the way we'll have to sort of counterbalance this new tendency is to advocacy for these kinds of public improvements and spaces in our cities. I guess that must be the last slide. So we're going to stop there. I think. Yes, that was what happened now.
So one of the cool things about actually finishing your PhD and getting a job is that you then get to invited to give commentary on people whose work you've admired and followed for years and years and years and years, and that's actually one of the things that happened for me today.
is that I started reading, I believe, Trinidad's work when I was a graduate student in the early 1990s when I first got my master's degree. Yes, I'm old, no comments necessary. And then Anastasia was one of my mentors at the University of California over at that other university in town. And so basically what we have here is a chapter, and you know, it's actually really kind of nice that we have a conceptual paper in this series because these are unbelievably difficult papers to write, and they are very, very difficult papers to present in PowerPoint form. So thank you very much for that. And so the chapter that I have is a draft, and my comments are primarily focused on pointing to things that I think you might be able to draw out to help structure the draft in a way that kind of helps people get to your main contributions a little bit faster. One of the things that I think in the chapter gets to be a little bit difficult to track is this notion of the acceleration of surveillance as a concept. That there, you know, the idea about enclosure and the concerns about the demise of public space have been around for some time in the theoretical literature about public space. This idea about surveillance is a little bit new. It's not entirely new. There's been some discussion about this, particularly since the onset of closed-circuit TV, which we had in the early 1980s, but then the idea of storage technologies that we could then go back and replay what was going on was a major change in how that technology really affected the ability of authorities to surveil. My problem with what we have in the chapter is that James Scott's book was life-changing for me when I read it. It's a book called Seeing Like a State, and I think it's absolutely marvelous. And this is in no way a reflection of the belief that that's not a good contribution to theory, but I do wonder about whether it does a sufficient job of explaining states' behavior in the aftermath of 9/11, and if we don't want to use that as the watershed moment, really in an era where we have more and more global attacks on citizens, which we can trace back to much earlier, right? And that if you sort of walk down the road that James Scott sends us on, what we have now is sort of states using these types of events, sort of the Naomi Klein argument, that states and corporations use these watershed, high-profile, disastrous events as an excuse to continue what they wanted to do anyway, right, which is surveil you, right? And I'm not convinced by that. I actually think that there has been a fundamental shift in some respects for democratic preference, which you sort of hinted at here. That there are large portions of the American public and in other parts of the world that believe themselves to be under threat, right? From, you know, miscreants, from people who would do the American way harm. And that fundamental democratic shift really means that we probably are talking about, in some respects, an imperative, right, for public space. That it needs to be, you know, if we want to create it as a pluralistic space or try to define a space for, you know, authentic Fourth Amendment democratic action, that this is actually the idea that this place be secure is an a priori condition of that for many of the people who would critique that position. And then I think that actually kind of requires a little bit of new theorizing, and you might actually find some help from Jeremy Wadron, who's not a built environment guy at all, but he's a political philosopher who published a book last year called Torture, Terror, and Trade-Offs, Political Philosophy for the White House. It's actually a marvelous book. He's a political philosopher and legal scholar out of NYU, I believe, unless somebody else hired him away. And it sort of talks about this idea that we really are not living in a world, the same world that we were living in a decade ago, and there are the reasons for that, and as a result, there are these ideas by which we can ethically think about the role that force plays in our foreign and policing policy. I'm not convinced by the arguments. I ultimately would reject them, but at least it's sort of a new theoretical universe for us to be thinking about this idea of what the state is doing, other than sort of falling back to, well, you know, this is what states do anyway, because that's who they are and that's what we said they were back in the day. The second thing is the technology side of your argument. I think you can probably push that further and update it for things that are coming online more recently that really are changing the world much faster than we can really keep up. And that's the idea of electronic data collection and facial recognition technologies and voice recognition technologies that are just vastly improved over anything that we really even imagined, and that have utterly reshaped what you can do with data, and have utterly reshaped what you can do with surveillance. I mean, at least with Bentham's, or with the panopticon, somebody had to be paid to sit there in the center of the panopticon. right? I don't have to have that anymore. I can just set up my tapes and I can use software to go through those tapes to look for particular people. Now that is a vastly different universe than when you had a security guard watching cameras, right? And so that's one of the things you might want to be thinking about, just sort of the way in which that technology has changed. And then finally, I think you give short shrift to cyber civitas here. And again, that would be pushing that technological argument in another way, is that if you think about it, the Rodney King example is vastly different from the other types of surveillance examples that you use. Because in a similar way in which technology has radically altered government's ability to surveil you, we now have new ways of surveilling back, right? And Rodney King is a primary example of that. So this is something that I think utterly shocked white audiences when they saw it on TV, right? And it all of a sudden brought about a whole new idea about accountability in the LAPD. And so you can see now that electronic technologies, while we might not have a global digital commons, we are definitely seeing some sort of hybrid interaction happening between this idea of social movement and protest and the digital world that you're seeing both in Europe and in BART, right? I mean, if digital technologies didn't matter, BART would not want to shut down access cell access when they're trying to keep people from protesting getting shot on BART. Right? Right? And then with the Occupy Wall Street stuff, you can go out and you can see a webcam of the people and the protesters, and they're using this as a means of trying to organize themselves both as they're on the street and as a way of trying to project a certain image about their message to much larger and broader audiences than they've ever had before. So I think you might want to be thinking about this both as a tension of where, yeah, this is something that the powerful use, but this is also one of the weapons of the week, to go back to James Scott. Okay? And then finally, planning. You know, one of the things that occurs to me when I think about this movement towards enclosure and this movement towards privatization and very corporate sort of pseudo-public private spaces that you talk about, like the Americana. First time I taught the urban social context here, I asked my undergraduate what their favorite public place was. And I think Stephanie was in that class, was my TA for that class. Do you remember what it was?
Did they say the Grove?
It was the Americana. Right. And I was like, oh, really? Not public, right? Not a public space, but it feels very much like a public space to them because they're outside, right? And this idea that there is some sort of political obligation or some sort of political freedom that is entailed with this space is entirely alien to most people who now walk around in public space. And the question is the genie so far out of the bottle that you can't shove it back in? And then two, if we're going to say to developers, you need to build this for us if you're going to get to build that for you, it's going to be very hard to tell them that they don't get to control what they build for us. So if the requirement is, hey, we're going to exact this and we're going to exact that, and you need to give us this, and there needs to be a park, and there needs to be parking, and there needs to be this, you're going to see the private sector's fingertips all over that thing that we exact from them. And in the words of my father, who has given me various and sundry very good advice in my life, including never get drunk on tequila, because you'll never recover tequila again. If you're going to take the man's money, you also have to eat his, right? And that means if you don't want to have corporate fingerprints on the public sphere, then maybe the public needs to start paying for its own goodies, right? And that's something that planners need to stand up and face. And this is unbelievably difficult in the universe, in the funding universe that we are now in, right? Where nothing is supposed to be taxed. We're never supposed to expect homeowners to pay for parks that directly benefit them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Don't tax you, don't tax me. Tax the developer behind the tree, right? Because he's the man with the money, and he's, we do have some levers that we can make him provide us with these quote unquote public spaces. So that's my 4 cents. All right.
I think as always, I very much appreciated Lisa's comments because they give a lot of food for thought. I want to say that one of the arguments of the paper was that there is a lot of discussion about how surveillance happens after 9/11, and we really did try to show, and in the few minutes probably was not as effective as we would hope, that surveillance starts much, much earlier, and there are different aspects of surveillance. And I think you mentioned that right now large portions of the population are feeling that they're under threat. But this has been, remember the Cold War. I mean, there has always been. But oftentimes, and at different points in time, and definitely in pre-modern times, the threat was always external. And now one can say, OK, Al-Qaeda is an external threat. But then look into this fear and obsession with homegrown terrorists and, and issues of crime, et cetera. In terms of, I very much appreciated your comment about technology, and I agree. And I think this could be an addition to what, how do you react to this? And the other example that I would add is, let's see what happened with Tahrir Square and also all these social networking and how it really helped kind of a grassroots movement to become. But I also say that they needed the space, they needed the setting to come together. So that's the. And lastly, about the comment about developers. Well, I'm not sure. I definitely agree that the public need to pay more for all these amenities, and I definitely would. I could never become a politician because I really want more taxes, and I agree with you on that. But I would also say that many of these spaces that you see there, what we call the privatized spaces, are in response to incentives that were given by the public sector. The developers often got something and back, and there are differences. I mean, if you look into San Francisco, the planning department has asked all the developers of these spaces to put plaques very visible that say that this is a public space. The Los Angeles planning department allowed the developers to say that this is a private space and permission can be revocable at any time. There are ways where the public sector, instead of asking for these spaces, within the premises can ask in lieu fees, and it has happened where they can use it to create public spaces where they're most needed. So there are different things that could happen. Yeah, I mean, as one developer told me once, this is the United States of America, and ideas like you're presenting will never happen because this is our space, and we want to control it, and we want to, and so I agree with you on that. But I think that the onus is a little bit on the public sector and the planning departments to do a little bit of a better job to ensuring that some of these spaces are more public.
No, I just first of all, thanks as usual. Lisa is very has an uncanny ability to sort of cut through the fluff and go to the heart of the point. And those 4 cents, each cent was worth quite a lot. No, I mean there is a kind of a tension here, and the question is, so what do you do about it? I mean, there is a normative side of our profession, of our life that we like to follow and abide by, and it's not just us. And there are other social theorists, philosophers, that are talking about all of that. I mean, when you think about this covering business, that one of the feminist theorists who talked about the Middle Eastern cities made a very interesting argument. He said that since the public space is really male domain, the women, when they have to come to public space, they have to cover themselves to make them invisible. So is this going to happen to all of us, that we're trying to make ourselves invisible and going into public space? I think that's a significant sort of change in our way of life and way of living. Yeah, there's no doubt that the technology has improved. In fact, one could argue that the advances in the information communication technology may actually obviate the need for public space. If the cyber civitas is where we will do our business, our social connection and social media, who needs public space? Because there is no need to. But the problem is there is a residual issue. So the only public space that's left is left for the people who don't have access to social media, who don't have, who are the poor, the drunk.
Just respond to that. Yeah. I think that what you're actually seeing, just to put my idea in there, is a hybrid notion of sort of political and social space that is actually occurring, and you're absolutely right. Like the fundamental notion of the street is still there. It's just the way in which people organize around it and use that street becomes sort of conveyed through this digital technology in different ways. And so just like, you know, electronic media, I spend all of my time on email arranging face-to-face meetings. That's all I ever do, right? That this hasn't really replaced the idea of face-to-face meeting, and this is an old lesson in planning. And that this is essentially, I think what's coming to the fore here is that the cyber civitas is not where the revolution is coming from, but it is a place by which people who are trying to revolutionize and create social change it's a mechanism by which they try to seek out other like-minded people to then geographically concentrate.
Yeah. And the other point I wanted to make with the technology thing, you know, in India they are now doing this iris. And for 1.2 billion people, they systematically started taking pictures. And for the first time, they're going to give every Indian citizen an ID card, which none of them had before. Now, now there are some interesting economic development questions, but one wonders also whether India is trying to, worrying about, you know, the terrorists and people from other countries coming in, causing trouble. So, so in a way, you know, there is sort of a permissive quality about the Indian society, which will, of course, some of that is lost, while there's some other kind of gain taking place. So there is a kind of a trade-off, and you know, we need to be aware of what we're losing, what we're gaining, and is the gain worth the loss?
Questions? I'm really fascinated by your point about paying attention to the history of surveillance, because I find it really very difficult to just simply say that the 9/11 attacks really changed things, because we have had suspicious behavior, we've had spying, historically all the time, you know, so.
I mean, not all the time, but I would argue much more.
Well, certainly certainly in the 20th century,
yes,
we've had amazing examples of surveillance of citizens and all kinds of things. And then you go back to the Soviet Union, where there's a whole other
yes,
variant on surveillance. But to me, the really different things is people's willingness to be subject to it without any real opposition. And so actually, that's kind of my question. Is there a place in this paper to actually think about people's, you know, the vast majority of the population doesn't seem to mind. And I don't really think it's because they don't know. I am fascinated by what people put up with at airports. You know, when historically would you have ever expected that people would submit to what they submit to at airports? And so to me, there's just something about perceptions and beliefs and values that is fundamentally changing.
I think what has been ingrained to the public, and definitely you see this much more heightened after 9/11, is the fear. And fear justifies, you know, the searches at the airport, and it justifies and so this fear has, during the Cold War, it was the fear of communism and the fear of, and so when this fear comes, and fear leads to some of the pathology of public spaces, and you know, there have been works that look into why parks are empty. I mean, I recently completed something that was published in Japan in 2010, where I would find that traditional public parks, tremendous underutilization, and talking to parents, you know, of middle school kids, they were afraid to let them alone, and they didn't have time, and so, you know, the kid is not at the park. So there's this fear that gets accentuated, and I think it gets much more accentuated certainly after certain events in history and certain sociopolitical circumstances, and certainly after 9/11, that creates, I would not call it apathy, but really what you're amazed by, the fact that people are much more willing to lend themselves to CCTV surveillance, to, you know, the searches at the airports and all that.
I mean, if I can add to that, the point about James C. Scott, you know, seeing like a state, And James Scott says also that what happens, when the state becomes too powerful seeing, it results in a sort of prostrate civil society. And so in a way, if the civil society becomes too timid and accepting all of that, yeah, this will continue to increase. So I mean, we have a American Civil Liberties Union who occasionally make noises, but you don't hear of that much anymore.
I want to push back and play devil's advocate for a second, simply because, I take off my shoes, I throw my bag down. I don't really feel that inconvenienced. It's annoying, but it's not really that onerous. And I have to say that I really do feel like, personally, my attitudes about surveillance and terrorism have changed a lot. Not with 9/11, but with London, right? With the London transit bombings. I'm just thinking, and some of your work, right, with Brian, just documenting the extent to which transit systems have been the targets of terrorism around the world. I gotta say, man, it takes me decades. I work in transit, right? It takes us decades and billions to get anything built. And the idea that it can get blown up because we're not sort of protecting assets with a reasonable amount of forethought annoys me, right? That in some respects, I feel like I'm sort of suspended between these two discourses where the idea that we should be afraid of something is treated like it's specious, right? That it's something that we use to sort of justify this larger trajectory of state control and corporate TSA kind of activities. And this idea that we should always be afraid, everything, they're after our women. I don't know how many of you have watched Dr. Strangelove, but do it immediately if you have not. There is this sort of middle ground there where, the question of fear has the tendency to polarize people, but where we really haven't had the opportunities to deliberate these ideas of what's a reasonable trade-off and what is not. And that kind of gets to Jeremy Wadron's point of, what might we be willing to give up so that, somebody doesn't blow up my Expo line as soon as I get it, right?
Just to counter the counter, there's all sorts of ways to deal with actual threats. The designers talk about hardening of things. So it doesn't directly imply that one's personal persona, one's privacy, has to necessarily be invaded in the way that one's privacy actually is. So to me, there's still kind of an indication there that there are alternatives, there are options, and yet there are certain options that are being selected over and over and over again.
And actually, I think Jim is absolutely right, because we, in that particular word that you refer to, the transit terrorism, there are 4 different types of reactions that have to do with more policing, more technology, more design, and outreach and public education. And over again, all these systems were choosing technology because it was the easiest, the safest, they felt, etc. However, if you were to ask, the public, they felt the less safe by simply having the cameras over there. And actually, they were pinpointing to, if someone really wants to do it, they can do it. I mean, a lot of the terrorists could put the bomb on themselves. There are so many transit stations that to protect them all, it's extremely, so there are different ways of doing it. And of course, there is a trade-off. And I think, of course, if you were to ask me, I think that it is a small price to pay to go through the, X-rays, etc. But if you start thinking of doing this in each and every station, in each and every neighborhood, are you, willing to do it? And would that bring transit completely?
And what we're disputing is not.
Terry is waiting to speak.
I'm going to stop here just a second. What we're disputing is the notion of reasonable, right? That's my point, right? What we're disputing is, where is that middle ground? Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to say that my thinking kind of got hung up much earlier than any of this, and it had to do with your statement of the social contract. And I don't know whether you can put it back up on the screen easily or not, maybe not, but it had to do with diversity and access and some of those nice things. it seemed more like a normative statement. It seemed like a statement of the world as we would like it to be, some of us would like it to be, rather than a statement of the contract as it is and has been.
Yeah.
You know, I was born in the South, and the first 12 years of my life were in the South. And what was ostensibly a public space where people go to vote was not a place that women felt welcome. I remember going to vote with my father. He would say, "Son, let's go vote." And at one point I said, well, what about Mom and what about my older sister, a 9-year older sister? Well, son, ladies don't get involved in politics. I mean, it's dirty stuff, you know, and so we men have to handle all of that. There weren't any, I mean, the 19th Amendment had been adopted in 1920, and in the mid-1940s, women still didn't feel in the South feel welcome in that public space. And I can just think of a lot of other examples where exclusion existed in those cities and towns that I grew up in that were not quite as explicit and as controlled as Americana or the Grove or some of the gated communities, but the norms were such that they were in fact exclusionary.
I think you're absolutely right, and if you think of the pinnacle of democracy, it has been said, is the democratic space, the Greek agora. Again, you have the same exclusion of women. There is no ideal public space. But we'll talk more about, you know, in the Erving Goffman idea of public space, which always in comparison to more private spaces where you can feel more loose, more tolerant, and you know, openness, tolerance, accessibility are always qualities that people associate with democratic public spaces. Are these qualities present in? Sometimes these qualities may not necessarily have to do with ownership. I mean, that you can have a privately owned space and which can be pretty accessible. But it is, I think I would fully agree with you, it is an ideal that it's oftentimes, most of the times, maybe always, never reached. But it is discussed as, when we talk about these polarities of public-private, you tend to find these factors much more likely to be in spaces that are more towards the public end of
so I wouldn't call
continuum.
It social that's not a statement of the social contract de facto. That's an aspirational statement of the social contract. The actual social contract would be stated much differently than that.
Even the way it is now, or yeah.
Well, the way it
has always been.
Well, I mean, but things have changed from your time, your childhood in South. Obviously, we have a different, much more expanded.
Well, look, you know, when my family moved here in 1950, as recently as 1950, people in Glendale were very proud of the fact, and they would say this openly, realtors would say this to you, that and they use much ruder language than this, no people of color will be found within the city limits after dark. So, you know, and they were proud of that.
Sure.
So, you know, I would say we can sort of track an evolution of the social contract over time. It's never been one thing. It's changed dramatically from the 19th century up to the present, but to state that as the existing social contract, I think, is more of an ideal than a fact.
Although you would find people of color in Pershing Square in the 50s, it's a traditional public space.
No, but I think in the constitutional, the exclusion is not, which is a form of discrimination, right? It's not constitutional, but
in the Constitution we had the poll tax until
no,
the early 20th century.
But these are
still,
part of the tenets of our social contract. I think. I mean, how they're enforced is a different. So it's not a social contract, something abstract.
And I would say that you would always need to compare because even in the 1950s, even at the height of, you know, these conflicts about race, it would be much more easier for a black man or a black woman to be in a public space than to be in a restaurant they had to go into, or to be even on the bus, right? So if you kind of always do it in comparison with the private space, you know, some of these tenets of public spaces were much more existent in these public spaces.
More, but still under severe limits, because I would just remind you of the Glendale example. Sure,
Yeah.
public space during the daytime, but not at night.
I think,
David?
Yeah, it's just a clarification about what you mean by public space. I'm not a planner, for those of you who don't know. So I'm just curious, because for me, public space is a national park or something like Griffith Park. And that's public space where the public can go. There's not a lot of surveillance there. And it is, some people say, America's greatest idea, these national parks. So they are very large, expansive territories that perhaps are not as well surveilled. I'm not sure people would be okay with putting cameras in those places to make them safer. The example you gave of parks, I'm not so sure that the public would be okay with that. So I'm just curious what you mean by that. And the counterexample is, you brought up San Francisco earlier, these new parklets that they're creating where they are getting rid of parking spots. These aren't your Fourth Amendment giant gathering grounds, but they are small little places where I, in fact, thought they were private until I walked up to it and there's a sign that says, this is public space, even though it's directly in front of a business, and you can sit down and work on your computer and no one can tell you to leave. So, and they are popping up all over the place. So I don't know if that's a pushback to your argument. I'm just curious.
No, actually we said that San Francisco is doing that.
Yeah.
These are public spaces, and even if they are within the boundaries of, or if they were created by the private sector, they were in response to incentives, and they have to be public. And so they really try to guard it quite zealously that these are public spaces. There are different types of public space. There is not one public space. National parks are certainly public space. But we have seen cameras in neighborhood parks. Glendale is an example. They have put, I forget now the name of the park, that they have not only cameras, but eavesdropping capabilities in the restrooms to protect from drug dealing and perceived crime. If you try to enter the park after 9 o'clock, there is infrared lights and that start and alarms that start sounding. And now, is this a public space or a private? It is a traditional public space. It is a traditional public forum. Streets are public spaces, sidewalks are public spaces, but when we say public, there is not an ideal public. I mean, in the book Sidewalks, I'm documenting a whole lot of actions that make the sidewalks much more private than what Jane Jacobs envisioned as the public ballrooms of the city. So there are different shades.
There is some ambiguity. For example, a city-owned museum or a public library, they're public spaces, right? They're owned by, or any government municipality buildings. But you cannot go to, cannot bring in a can of Coke into a museum or speak loudly in a public library. Sorry?
He's studying the Presidio right now, and actually that's a really nice example, I think, of one of the things that, because I mean the library is the one that you kind of brought up, and it's a place that's been surveilled for a long time, has always had security guards, and is contested, right? There's this contested notion of whether homeless people should be allowed in or out. And there's always these sorts of arguments about the comfort level of other patrons, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the Presidio example that David's studying, I think, is actually a nice sort of exemplar of this idea of enclosure and change.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, Presidio is going to basically privatize, basically, right?
And the library is a dedicated, actually the Supreme Court has classified public spaces in 3 categories. There are the traditional public forums like the streets, the parks, the squares. The library is a dedicated public space. So the openness and activities that you can do in dedicated public spaces are a little bit less, at least as recognized by the Supreme Court. And then there are the other public spaces like the prisons. The prison is a public space, but you cannot do anything of what we're talking about. And I think nobody would contest the fact that you need to have cameras in the prisons and things like that.
So one distinction may be the public realm versus public space. So the library, museum, street, freeways, they're all part of the public realm, right? But the public space, then once you go beyond that, traditional parks and plazas and mini parks and streets and things like that, it gets to get a little bit murky as to where do you draw the line, because it's not obviously, as I said, no library will allow you to walk in and speak loudly. They have their own code of behavior that you have to follow. And some public space may actually charge you money too, to entry fees and all that. But the Presidio, isn't the ownership of Presidios changing from public ownership to private ownership?
It's way more complex than that.
Yeah.
It's a government corporation
Yeah.
that is allowing private leases on the
Right.
land, but not ownership. So it's
So the land is owned by these things.
yeah, they're very sensitive to the use of the word privatization.
Yeah.
They definitely do not consider that to be what's taking place. It is a national park.
Right.
It has not ceased to be one. But
It's just like the faculty housing in UC Irvine campus, right? I mean, the university land belongs to the University of California, state, and you can buy a condo, but you're only buying the,
And you're paying rent for the land.
and then you pay lease for the land.
Right.
So yeah, there are all kinds of could get easily murky, and then
Yeah.
I have a question. Just kind of something that Lisa had said. I wonder if younger people have just become more compliant to surveillance, in the sense that, you know, I watch reality TV and think, why would anybody want a camera to follow them around all
For
the
the
time?
money.
For the money. I don't think they even get paid that much, or, you know, to try and do other.
or why would anybody get any kick out of watching
yeah.
the audience? I more worry about audience.
I mean, there's just so many things where, like you were saying, you're participating and surveilling ourselves, and I think there's part of the thing like, you know, who cares if walking through this thing and take my shoes off? I mean, I've already, you know, text my naked self to all my friends, you know.
Yeah.
Well, you know what I mean?
Sexting.
You have?
Yeah, we don't end up going out in burqas, but the idea that we have some sort of entitlement to privacy becomes extinct, right? And that so much, they're so used to being on display and being displayed in various ways that it's, our notions of privacy and comfort and that kind of stuff becomes an extinct notion in
There
society.
are some of the most fascinating works that are happening right now, and I guess we have to wait for the next 5 years and we'll see many more, is actually the impact of social networking on issues of privacy. I was listening to a public radio story recently about how employers, I mean, beware what you put up on Facebook. I mean, how employers, in order to employ people, do go to Facebook and find embarrassing stuff and then don't employ. And so all that, but as you say, this people do it on their own. I mean, you cannot.
When you're a freshman in a
accuse-
college, you know, you don't think about your future employment, right?
Also, you put embarrassing stuff on YouTube, and yet people do it. Right.
Yeah.
And yet people do it routinely. I mean, the young woman from UCLA, I mean, the long-term damage to her trajectory is pretty severe, right, until she sort of becomes old news, right? And that was entirely her own choice. And it's a very weird thing about this new relationship to the public gaze, I think, and,
Right.
and that gets enmeshed in ideas of fame and celebrity and being seen.
this is
that
the
are-
girl who said she didn't like Asians. Or
Yes,
Yes.
right, and that
The YouTube.
you know, that was not somebody forcing that on her. That was technology that she was entering into a conversation with her own sort of youth and lack of judgment and value and stuff like that.
Right.
But even I think Brian Taylor is looking into youth movement and how it is very much where they congregate and their transportation choices, and how this is facilitated by all these cell texting messages. I mean, there's some very interesting work that is happening that I think in the next 5 years we'll see more of, which definitely redefine concepts of publicness and privacy and things like that, and social contract.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.